you got to share like what the typical training day with Chuck was like back then.
Well, the thing I always point out to people is the reason Chuck got to what the legendary status that he achieved. And by the way, people got to remember this is back in the days of point karate, but a lot of times there wasn't protective equipment and everything else, even though it was not full contact. And but Chuck was, as you know, world champion, as they would call it in those days, and it's evidenced by his commitment to training. When we train 6 days a week at his house in a place called Rolling Hills Estates, out past the airport in LA. And then were minimum of 3 hour workouts where it'd be push-ups and sit-ups and everything else, conditioning and just hours of kicking, which was more of his style. It was originally Tang Soo Do, we call it Chun Kuk Do, and then it became the Chuck Norris system. But it was a lot of kicking, a lot of stuff that I wasn't used to. Being Goju, we were more like kick off the back foot and put it back down.
Mhm.
They were front foot kickers and everything else. But the workouts were grueling and incredibly disciplined. And you hardly ever missed a workout. And this went on for years. And so the other thing that I learned from Chuck and why he became so good is his openness to learn. We would just find people, whether it's a George Dillman or whoever, people that had something interesting to offer. And Chuck had ended up inviting them out and bring them out to the house to train. Jean-Claude Van Damme was one of those, in the
Yeah,
very early
I remember back in the day. Yeah,
years.
seeing that.
So, people like that would come out. And in other words, he was very open to being a student, which I think is a big lesson for all martial artists, because I would say to them, if anyone could sort of go, well, I'm Chuck Norris, I'm a master of all, that was so far from the way he presented himself as a martial artist. Like he was very good at what he did.
Well, I'm not going to burden myself saying this is the only way. If I'd have done that, I would never won a tournament.
Now, uppercut, right hand, uppercut into the jaw. Two.
If I'm going to fight a top-notch fighter, I would actually, in my mind, create fight scenes in my mind against this individual. I'd see where his strong points were, or how he would attack, and how could I defend against his strong attacks.
When I introduced the Machado brothers to Chuck, with jiu-jitsu, and again, I'm just making this very short, but when we opened their first school for them through Bob Wall and Chuck, Bob Wall had a shopping center he managed, and he gave them a space to open as an academy. I always tell people the first person on the mat wearing a white belt was Chuck Norris. He didn't come in wearing a black belt and wanting special privileges. He was totally enthused and happy to just be a student and learn something new. And I think that's very instructive, for a lot of us, that we should always remember we're students of the arts. There's always something new to learn. And the problem happens when you come to think of yourself as a master and that you've achieved everything. And I think that's when the growth stops. And again, it's just a way of saying that Chuck's been an incredible role model from that point of view, with his openness to always wanting to better himself, to learn and to experience other arts if that was going to make him a better martial artist overall.
That's so great to hear about Chuck. Can you share some experience in training with Benny the Jet, another legend?
Yeah, well, Benny, you probably know I did a movie by the way, a lot of these people I met through Chuck. You can
Mhm.
imagine if coming out from Australia, I wouldn't have had access to a lot of these gentlemen had I not had the introduction, that was brought forward by Chuck. Chuck was so well liked and respected. And so I met Benny Urquidez. We ended up doing a movie called Force 5, which, as you know, was Joe Lewis and
Mhm.
Master Bong Joon, a few of them. But anyway, I worked with Benny in that. I started training with Benny in would have been the very early 80s. This is before the Jet Center started. And we used to go to his brother Arnold's house, Arnold Urquidez, who is, again, had a reputation as one of the toughest martial artists you would ever run into. And I would go out there and we'd train in this big kind of shed at the back of Arnold's house. It was bare bones. He had some European kickboxers with visits sometimes, but I started training there, and again another baptism by fire to sort of get into the world of Benny the Jet. Because again, you'll never you'll never meet a martial artist with a bigger heart than Benny. You know, he's absolutely a warrior in every sense of the word. So to be training one on one with somebody like that, I mean, what greater gift, you know, you get as a martial artist than to have that opportunity. So we would train there again, the Jet Center. I forget exactly what year the Jet Center opened, but then I started training every day at the Jet Center. And that's when I met Pete Cunningham, Sugarfoot, you know, another undefeated kickboxing champion. He was Canadian, born in Trinidad, but he was one of Benny's students. I started training with Petey, trained with him for something like 30 years. And the Jet Center was just, again, a who's who. You know, you would get boxing champions coming there, all sorts of martial arts would come in. It was a big melting pot of incredible individuals. So to be immersed in a learning environment like that is just second to none. I can't even imagine it being the same anymore. And Benny, he was the one everybody aspired to. I mean, his dedication to being the best he could possibly be. You know, he would train with anybody, get in a ring with anybody. I love Benny because he's a doer. One of his favorite sort of responses when martial artists would come in and start saying, well, we do this and we do that. He said, don't tell me, surprise me. You know, he said, let's get in the ring, let's move around. In other words, he was not about the words, it was about what you did that determined, you know, whether you were good at what you did or not, you know. And he just set the bar so high with his dedication. And still, Centre Benny was just out in Australia a few weeks ago, and Benny's a bit younger than me. He's 70. I'm 74 now, but Benny's 70, and the amount of people remarked, and look at the way he moves, and you know what I mean. He still looks like he's in his 40s, and again, that's because he's a doer. He's yes, he talks the game as well, but he's involved 100% in everything that he expects anybody else around him to do. And again, I think that's very instructive, you know, by the way he behaves as a martial artist. He's very spiritual, as you know. He's very faith-based. And I'd finish off by both those people, if Chuck and Benny that you've mentioned. I have a saying that it's not the 2 hours on the mat that matters, it's the 22 hours off the mat. Like when you take your belt and your gi off or your kickboxing short, how are you as a person? And I believe that's what determines you as a martial artist and not just, say, a sportsman. And both those gentlemen are the epitome of that with the way they behave. Like Benny just walks the walk, you know. He has morals, he has principles, he has integrity, he has loyalty. And as you probably know, David, a lot of martial arts that's severely lacking, I think, in a lot of the areas that we're in nowadays. But I always take strength from knowing that people like Chuck, people like Benny are still again walk the talk, you know, and think that's very, very important.
Definitely. Wow. Thanks so much for sharing. So amazing to hear that about Chuck. I mean, I've met Benny, but I've never met Chuck, but I kind of figured he's like the way you describe, you know, it's very nice to hear that, of course, because he's a role model for a lot of people. And like you said, it's those other 22 hours. It's not just, oh, he's great at karate, but he's just such a good person. That's great to hear.